Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into a time when even your mattress had a moral alignment. Picture this, a wooden bed frame creaking inside a damp stone cottage, rushlight flickering, the wind howling through a narrow shutter. You're exhausted from tilling soil or mending boots all day, your joints are stiff, and all you want is to crawl into bed next to your spouse, but wait. Is it Tuesday? Because that's probably forbidden. Are you lying face to face? That might be a problem. Did you remember to say the right prayers? The church might have a few thoughts on that. This is the curious, candlelit world of 1250, when the church didn't just guide your soul, it gave very specific feedback on your bedtime behavior. You'll discover tonight that even under your blanket, someone was spiritually watching. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the muddy streets of a 13th century town, your woolen hood tugged against the drizzle. Inside a stone chapel, the priest is softly preaching a sermon that sounds oddly anatomical. And that's because he is, sort of. His topic, marital morality. Delivered in Latin, interpreted in hushed whispers, and understood with a generous dose of social guesswork. This is not the fire and brimstone stuff of public doom. No, this is intimate theology. It's bedtime protocol according to the Holy Roman Church. Now, let's clear something up. People were absolutely doing it. All the time. They just didn't talk about it unless you were a priest, monk, or theologian, in which case you were absolutely writing about it. Obsessively. The irony is hard to miss, those who took vows of celibacy became the era's most prolific bedroom advisors. You settle onto a lumpy straw mattress shared by a village couple. They married young, often by arrangement, and if they were lucky, had 1 or 2 moments in their day without livestock in the room. The church didn't object to marital intimacy in itself. In fact, it promoted it. But it did object to nearly everything else about it. Mainstream fact? By 1250, the church had codified clear rules of purity for marital intimacy, mostly drawn from thinkers like Augustine and later Peter Lombard. According to them, intimacy was permitted only within marriage, for the purpose of procreation, and performed in what they called the natural's way, which, spoiler alert, was fairly narrow. But what's natural, you ask? Good question. That's where it gets crunchy. And by crunchy, we mean weirdly specific. The only fully licit position was the one they believed reflected divine order, man on top, facing the woman, in darkness, quietly, and ideally after prayer. It symbolized heaven above, earth below. Any deviation was, at best, a venial sin. At worst, mortal. Still, historians argue whether these teachings were truly enforced or just idealistic guidelines. After all, what priest was peeking through cottage windows at night? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. The threat of sin loomed over daily life, even if the details were fuzzy. Let's talk sensory detail. The bed you lie on tonight is a rope-tied wooden frame. The ropes sag. The straw mattress pokes. The blanket is scratchy wool, and there's a definite smell of onions and animal fur. Privacy? Minimal. The door is a cloth. The kids might be asleep in the corner. And yet, this is your space, your sanctum. You sneak under the covers and hope the saints aren't watching too closely. Fringe tidbit, some theologians debated whether certain acts were more sinful if performed while enjoying them. That's right, pleasure was itself suspect. It wasn't about how, it was about how much. According to some texts, even within marriage, enjoyment could stain the act. This led to advice like be quick, avoid laughter, and definitely don't sing about it later. Looking at you, troubadours. One joke scrawled in a marginal note of a monastic manuscript suggests a monk heard a confession so detailed, he needed a separate scroll just for diagrams. We'll come back to that. Here's something delightfully awkward. Many people genuinely didn't know the rules. Literacy rates were low. Latin was the church's language. So much of the moral code was transmitted orally, by sermons, gossip, and occasional bedroom counseling during confession. That meant rules were absorbed through repetition and social cues. You weren't handed a pamphlet on your wedding day. You just slowly picked up that Wednesday was slightly less acceptable than Thursday and that lying on your side might land you in hot water with St. Jerome. We arrive now at the metaphor of the bedroom as a battlefield of temptation. Not just against adultery or desire, but against chaos. The church feared chaos above all, loss of hierarchy, disruption of divine order. And where was hierarchy more literally flipped than in the bed? So the act had to be orderly. Husband leads, wife receives. Heaven above, earth below. Any reversal was a symbolic rebellion. You stir beneath the itchy blanket. A mouse scuttles in the rafters. Someone snores 2 cottages down. The town is asleep, but somewhere a cleric is scribbling furiously about the moral ranking of embracing your spouse after dinner. It's oddly calming to know people have always had rules to stress over. Let's take a moment to meet one of these scribblers, Alan of Lille, a 12th century theologian who wrote, "Sin begins in the gaze, swells in thought, bursts forth in touch." Romantic, no? His work influenced others who compiled sin lists so long they needed indexes. These lists specified that positions involving standing, kneeling, or creativity were discouraged. Also discouraged, trying anything on feast days, fast days, Sundays, Fridays, Lent, or during pregnancy. This left Tuesdays in late spring? Yet again, historians still argue whether this was enforced doctrine or anxious overreach. Archaeological evidence suggests people did what people do. There's not much physical evidence of compliance, no chastity belts nailed to doorways, no approved bedposts. Instead, there's a quiet undercurrent of improvisation, guilt, and whispered confession. Let's not forget the ambient sounds of this world. Bells tolling the canonical hours, cows shifting in their stalls, the occasional far-off owl. Imagine trying to focus on moral purity while your goat is nibbling the laundry. Now picture a young couple, married just 2 weeks. They're sharing stew in a wooden bowl, surrounded by flickering candlelight. He's nervous. She's sleepy. Both have vague ideas of what's allowed. They've been told not to act like animals, not to show too much enthusiasm, and to remember that the angels can see through the roof. Somewhere in this scene, a kind of tenderness survives, awkward, unsure, but real. We end this section with an oddly reassuring idea, that even in a world where every bodily function had a moral label, people still found their way toward affection, laughter, and warmth, albeit while looking over their shoulder for invisible angels. You haven't moved much from that lumpy straw mattress. The fire has died down to glowing embers, and the wind outside has a lonely whistle to it. But your mind? It's wide awake, picking over the quiet rules no one told you, but somehow everyone seemed to know. Tonight, we delve into the question you didn't know you were supposed to ask: what exactly counts as a sin beneath the sheets, and what, in the surprisingly bureaucratic worldview of 1250, might get a humble peasant a heavenly pass? You shift your weight, trying not to squeak the bedframe again. There's a list, of course, several, actually. Sin lists, confession guides, penance manuals. The church was nothing if not organized in its moral bookkeeping. So let's flip through the metaphysical filing cabinet together. We begin with the basic breakdown. All sexual acts were graded, like awkward school assignments, into categories. The top prize was licit marital intimacy for procreation. Congratulations, you've passed. Everything else? That's where the sliding scale began. And boy, did it slide. Mainstream fact, by 1250, theologians had ranked sexual sins with almost comical granularity. For example, marital intimacy during a church feast day? Sinful. Using any part of the body that wasn't considered natural? Sinful. Doing anything for pleasure alone, even with your spouse? Slightly sinful. Too much enthusiasm? Sinful. Thinking about it the next morning and smiling? Possibly sinful. Telling your friends about it? Definitely sinful, but also oddly popular. It's easy to laugh now, but back then, this wasn't joke material, it was cosmic risk management. You weren't just trying to avoid embarrassment. You were trying to avoid hell. Eternal fire was on the line. That's a lot of pressure to bring into the bedroom. And here's a fringe tidbit that might make you sit up. If your back weren't sore from that rope mattress, some confession manuals instructed priests to ask about positions during confession. Yes, that's right. Imagine murmuring to Father Jeffrey behind the wood lattice that you, a simple cooper, allowed your wife to be, shall we say, on top. The priest may look scandalized, take a moment to compose himself, and then assign you penance, perhaps a week of fasting, or walking barefoot to the next parish chapel. Not because it hurt anyone. Not because it was violent. But because it reversed divine order. That's the theme tonight. Not pleasure versus pain. Not right versus wrong. But order versus chaos. And that brings us to one of the great historical debates in this field. Yes, this field has debates. Historians still argue whether these sin rankings reflected real enforcement or just ecclesiastical daydreams. Did people actually confess this stuff? Or were these handbooks just the medieval equivalent of HR training slides, painfully specific, rarely used, and mostly good for ironic commentary? Let's walk, in your mind, to the town confessional. It's a dark alcove, and the air smells of wax and damp stone. A man kneels, red-faced, and stammers out his worries. We were facing each other, Father. The priest nods solemnly, as if this were a confession of grave theft or blasphemy. Then he sighs, flips open his manual, and gives a well-practiced response. 3 days fasting, say 10 Ave Marias, and please, try to remember next time, on your back, always facing up, preferably thinking of Christ. You shake your head, amused and slightly disbelieving. And yet, this was the fabric of spiritual life. Now, in case you're wondering whether anyone ever got a free pass, well, they tried. That's where intention came in. If you meant to conceive a child, that was a mitigating factor. If it was a spontaneous act of affection, and you stopped once you remembered it was Friday, still a little sinful, but you might get mercy. If it was during Lent, and you planned it, and you lit candles for the mood, oh dear. Better clear your calendar. You'll be repenting through Michaelmas. One theological giant, Thomas Aquinas, believed that even within marriage, intimacy could become sinful based on attitude. He claimed that unnatural desire included things like lusting after one's own spouse. And how does one not? That's a mystery best left to the scholars. Aquinas tried to navigate this strange tension between spiritual ideal and physical reality. He wasn't trying to be cruel, just consistent. In his view, the soul was a fragile thing, easily smudged by pleasure. You lie back on the straw pillow and think about that. The soul, smudged. Like a wax tablet blurred by too warm a hand. Now let's dive into a few specific examples from the guides. One late 12th century penitential text lists intercourse standing up as a worse sin than doing so in the proper manner, but less sinful than intercourse outside the house. Apparently, location mattered. If it happened in a barn or a field, that carried extra penance, possibly because it invited others to stumble upon it, or because it risked mimicking animals. There was a lot of anxiety about animal-like behavior. Medieval theologians were not fans of improvisation. Which brings us to one of the more surreal consequences of this system. Many people developed a sort of checklist mentality. Like pilgrims crossing off shrine visits, couples began keeping track, avoiding certain days, certain moods, certain positions. Imagine whispering, "Not tonight, dear, it's the feast of St. Bridget and we're supposed to be pious." Or, "Quick, before the bells toll Carmpline, we'll pray after." And yet, despite all these rules, there was love. There was laughter. There was mischief. Remember, behind every severe church teaching was a person or a monk, a priest, a scribe, writing it down with one hand while probably shaking his head with the other. Many of them included little notes in the margins, "People won't listen to this," or "too strict," or, in one case, just a small doodle of what looks suspiciously like a goat shrugging. This gives us our fringe fact of the night. there is at least one manuscript from the 1200s where a monk included a series of "do not illustrate this" warnings next to blank spaces that later scribes absolutely filled in with awkward drawings. Human nature, immortalized in ink. Let's not forget the sensory palette here. Candles burned low, casting soft light on uneven walls. Beds creaked like ships at sea. Linen sheets, if you were lucky, scratched like paper. The air was often thick with smoke, sweat, and tallow. Privacy wasn't a luxury, it was a miracle. So how did people reconcile it? How did they make peace with this eternal balancing act between affection and sin, between desire and damnation? One answer: they simply tried their best. People confessed, fasted, muttered prayers, and then got on with the business of living. They raised children, loved each other, and laughed when the goat knocked over the candle. Sin was ever present, yes, but so was grace. And that's your takeaway tonight. The rules were rigid, but life was squishy. People weren't saints or sinners. They were muddy-footed, onion-eating, blanket-sharing humans, navigating moral mazes in drafty cottages, hoping their confessor didn't ask too many follow-up questions. You shift on your mattress and sigh. Maybe you'll get it right next Tuesday. Or maybe St. Bridget will understand. Either way, there's comfort in knowing we've all spent centuries just trying to be good, whatever that meant at the time. You're still in that same dark room, the fire nearly out, your blanket drawn up to your chin. The silence is deeper now, like the whole village has stopped breathing. Somewhere, an owl hoots. And as you lay there, still trying to process that entire bit about goat doodles and sins ranked by posture, you begin to wonder, what did it mean for a single position to be not only preferred, but holy? Tonight, you learn that the most boring position imaginable was also, somehow, the only one endorsed by heaven. It's called the missionary position today, but back in 1250, no one was calling it that, not yet. The name wouldn't even be coined for centuries. But the idea? Oh, it was alive and well. Man above, woman below, face to face, in the dark, under blankets. That was the only fully licit, blessed, sanctified form of marital intimacy in the eyes of the Church. Mainstream fact: medieval theologians and church authorities taught that this position mirrored the order of the cosmos. It represented divine hierarchy, a man leading, woman submitting, heaven above, earth below. A kind of bodily metaphor for salvation. And just to really cement that symbolism, it was recommended, sometimes even required, that couples pray both before and after the act. Not a romantic whisper of "that was lovely," but actual, kneeling, Latin prayer. Gratitude not for pleasure, but for participating in the divine plan of reproduction. You try not to chuckle. Thanks be to God, we did it without smiling. Aquinas, that overachieving theologian we met last section, had a lot to say about this. He believed that any deviation from this sacred form, even if done between married partners, distorted the intent of the Creator. In other words, if you got fancy, you got sinful. As if there were a metaphysical referee throwing down a flag for excessive creativity. But the reasoning wasn't purely symbolic. There was a moral logic underneath. If marital intimacy was meant for procreation, then anything that complicated, interrupted, or overly stylized the act was seen as a distraction from that purpose. And distraction, in this context, was dangerous. Fringe tidbit: one lesser-known manual written by a Cistercian abbot included a brief passage advising husbands not to allow the wife to move atop, for this indicates the woman's spiritual dominance, which is disordered and unclean. There's no record of whether that abbot ever kissed anyone. But he certainly had opinions. So you return to that bed in the corner of your imagination. You're lying flat, arms straight at your sides like a board, and you're trying to remember if it's Thursday or a feast day. The air is still, heavy with wood smoke. Your partner lies quietly beside you. Both of you are squinting toward the ceiling, wondering if you remembered to pray beforehand. You did, right? Historians still argue whether medieval couples actually conformed to these expectations. There's your debate phrase. Some scholars argue that the rigidity of church teaching had only limited reach into the countryside, where folk customs and common sense often overruled doctrine. Others insist that fear of hell ran deep enough to shape behavior in even the most intimate spaces. And then there's a third camp, bless them, that says everyone just sort of did their best and confessed the rest. Now, remember, this position wasn't just the best option. It was, for many, the only acceptable one. The manuals weren't filled with helpful diagrams or loving encouragement. They were filled with warnings. One German text from the early 1200s warns that lying together in any manner where the man is not above is an inversion of holy order and a sign of moral collapse. That's quite a bit of pressure for a sleepy farmer who just hauled hay all day. The sensory world comes into sharper focus again. The bed is noisy. The straw pokes through the linen. There's the constant scratch of wool. If you're a wealthier couple, maybe you've got a feather pillow or two, but most likely, it's flattened straw and a lot of sharing body heat. And in that space, you're expected to hold a perfect pose, perform your duty silently, think only of reproduction, and then kneel to thank God. You can't help but feel sympathy for these couples. There's barely any room for humor or connection. And yet, somehow, love still grew there. Babies were born. Laughter slipped through the cracks. And sometimes, rebellion too. Because here's the thing, even in a world this tightly bound by rules, people inevitably experimented. And not always out of lust or rebellion. Sometimes out of love. Sometimes because the mattress sagged too much in the middle. Sometimes because you bumped your head on the rafters trying to pray afterward. And the church knew that. That's why the manuals existed. Not because people never strayed from the missionary position, but because they absolutely did. We're back now to the confessional booth. The same awkward conversations, the same sheepish admissions. One man confesses that he and his wife had lain side by side, tired from a funeral. The priest gives a slow sigh and assigns a fast. Another woman confesses they'd been too loud, her husband laughed too much. That got a stern talking to. One of the more surreal entries in a 13th century penitential reads, "If a man and wife should lay together in mirth, and forget their solemn purpose, let them both fast bread and water for 3 days, and speak no soft words to each other." Imagine, a punishment for pillow talk. Another curious passage describes the acceptable garments to wear during intimacy. Ideally, you were both partially clothed, in nightshirts that reached past the knees. Nakedness was risky. It might excite the imagination, and the imagination, of course, was a gateway to sin. Think of it as the first documented case of bedtime dress code enforcement. You sigh again, shifting gently under your woolen blanket. These people, these stiff-backed, church-fearing, candle-burning souls, had so much to remember. And yet, somehow, they still managed to build relationships, to care for one another, and to find comfort in the rituals they could control. Because yes, behind all the theological jargon, there was often something comforting about rules. In a world full of famine, disease, unpredictable weather, and feudal lords with questionable hygiene, having a clear guide, even one as bizarre as a holy position list, offered a strange kind of safety. So you turn over, carefully, mind you, don't want to anger the angels, and reflect on this cosmic blueprint. Above you, the thatched ceiling forms a crooked triangle. Beyond that, stars you'll never see. And somewhere up there, according to church teaching, is a God who wants you to reproduce efficiently, sleep with dignity, and never, ever try anything acrobatic. But also, perhaps, a God who smiles, just a little, when the goat knocks over the candle. The bed creaks again, just a tiny shift of your leg, but in this 13th century silence, even that sound feels like it echoes across the centuries. You've just learned that the missionary position reigned supreme, backed by divine order and theological footnotes. But your sleepy mind is still stirring. What if you turned just a little? What if you, let's say, flipped things around? What would the church say then? Tonight, you tumble gently into the world of topsy-turvy intimacy, positions deemed improper, unnatural, or downright dangerous by the spiritual authorities of the age. Welcome to the risky business of turning sideways. Mainstream fact, the medieval church didn't only instruct what was good. It got surprisingly vivid about what was bad. Deviation from the accepted position, man above, woman below, face to face, wasn't just seen as a quirky choice. It was coded as a rebellion against divine structure. Some penance manuals, especially those produced in the early 1200s, went into detail cataloguing deviant acts, including lying side by side, standing, sitting, rear-facing, or, heaven help you, reversing the roles entirely. One confessor's guide, written in France, warned that if the woman should ride the man, then surely is the devil in the room. That's not metaphor. That's a spiritual claim. You imagine that poor woman, just trying to be playful on a quiet Thursday, now accused of conjuring a demon with bad posture. But it wasn't just fear of demons. It was about control. The church believed physical roles reflected spiritual truth. The man, like Christ, was meant to lead. The woman, like the church, was to be receptive and obedient. Swap that around, even symbolically, and suddenly you're not just changing position. You're challenging centuries of sacred hierarchy. Fringe tidbit. In one obscure German tract, a priest argued that lying on one side was suspect because it mirrored the posture of animals who copulate without reason or intent. Essentially, spooning was for swine. Which raises the question, how closely were these priests observing farm animals? And why? The church's moral geometry didn't stop at orientation. Movement mattered too. Stillness pleases God, one text insists. Let the act be brief, solemn, and directed to its end. Try to imagine that in practice, two exhausted peasants under a scratchy blanket, trying to time everything just right, face forward, no smiles, no extra motion, no murmuring, and absolutely no flipping over for variety. And here comes our scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether most people actually took these no-turning rules seriously. Were medieval couples truly frightened into spiritual paralysis every night? Or did they nod politely at sermons, then go home and work out their own choreography? The honest answer is likely a mix. Some complied, others didn't, and still more confessed later and made peace with the occasional side-sleeping indiscretion. Let's picture it. You're curled in bed with your partner, the air crisp and your toes numb. You roll to your side, hoping the fire's embers warm your back. Your spouse does the same. You're now facing the same direction, knees brushing. It feels safe. Comforting. And yet, somewhere in your head, a tiny, papery voice whispers, that's not how heaven intended it. But really? What harm could come from a bit of variation? Well, if you asked a 13th century confessor, the answer might involve spiritual decay, the corruption of roles, or possibly the risk of eternal damnation. They took form seriously. To the modern ear, it sounds absurd. To them, it was sacred architecture. The body was a cathedral. And the act, a liturgy. Do it wrong, and you weren't just sinning, you were blaspheming with your thighs. Let's wander through one of those penitential books together, just us and the flicker of a candle. One entry reads, if a man should lie beneath his wife, and she above, he is to abstain from meat and ale for 1 month, and walk barefoot in the cold for 7 days. That's a long sentence for a moment's spontaneity. But the punishment tells us something important. This wasn't just about sex. It was about control, hierarchy, and discipline. By enduring cold feet, bland meals, and physical discomfort, the penitent was realigning his soul and his body to divine expectations. You stretch beneath your woolen blanket and imagine how those rules felt in practice. Did couples lie still out of fear? Or giggle quietly in the dark, rolling over despite it all, hoping angels had other things to do? Fringe anecdote time. In one confessor's notes from the Low Countries, a woman reportedly asked her priest, "May I turn on my side if my belly aches?" The priest paused, no answer was written. We can only imagine he went to consult a higher-ranking cleric or flipped through the rulebook of righteous reclining positions. Either way, no verdict was recorded. Which suggests the system, even in its rigidity, sometimes ran up against reality. And this is the part where we come back to that ever-present blend of rule and real life. The guides were detailed, yes. But life was messy. People adapted. They negotiated. And, perhaps most importantly, they talk to each other. Quietly, at night, in whispers. You imagine a husband and wife in a thatched cottage. They've been married 12 years. They know the rules, but tonight, her back hurts, and he's not feeling particularly priestly. They lie facing away from each other. Their knees touch. There's no passion, no loud joy, just shared breath and body warmth. Is that sin? The manuals might say yes. But your heart whispers otherwise. And isn't that the contradiction of this entire doctrine? That something so intimate, so full of quiet connection, could be branded disordered based on angles and geometry? One last visual before you drift further into stillness. In a monastery not far from Chartres, a marginal illustration shows a man in bed with his wife. Above them, angels. Around them, demons. Each holding scrolls. One scroll reads, "He turns her like bread upon the coals." It's a culinary metaphor for a sin that, in all likelihood, was just a sleepy couple trying not to get stiff necks. So here you are, centuries later, lying in your own bed. You can stretch, roll, curl, or sprawl. And as you do, you carry this odd inheritance, rules carved into parchment by candlelight, meant to guide souls who just wanted to be warm, to be close, and to feel less alone. The fire is just a glow now, barely more than a red breath behind the hearthstones. You nestle deeper into the mattress, if only to avoid the cool air curling in through the gaps in the window shutters. Your mind, though, is still busy. Not flipping over, not dreaming just yet, but pondering something strange you overheard at the village well. Apparently, there are days you're not even allowed to try. That's right. You've just stumbled into one of medieval Christianity's most surprising and confusing bedroom policies, the forbidden calendar. Tonight, you discover that the church not only had opinions on how you loved, but also when you were allowed to. Mainstream fact, by 1250, much of Europe lived under a rhythm dictated not just by seasons and harvests, but by the liturgical calendar. The church divided time into clean and unclean for days, when intimacy was encouraged, tolerated, discouraged, or outright banned. These included Sundays, feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent, Ember days, Rogation days, certain saints' days, and the eve of almost anything holy. Yes, that's most of the year. And here's where it gets weirdly specific. Theologians created complex timetables showing which days were off-limits and which were, if not celebrated, at least spiritually acceptable. One 13th-century confessor's manual advised against marital relations on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, as well as during all of Lent, the 40 days before Christmas, the week after Easter, Pentecost, and, for good measure, on the eve of receiving communion. You stretch your limbs and do the sleepy math. That leaves, maybe 90 safe days a year? Assuming you're well, your spouse is willing, you're not traveling, and the goat hasn't eaten your only pair of clean nightclothes. And if you think this sounds strict, you're not alone. Historians still argue whether these forbidden days were widely observed in practice or just part of the moral idealism that made confessionals overflow. Some point to letters and sermons suggesting common folk mostly ignored these rules, others argue that fear of sin and eternal punishment kept people obedient. But even if the rules were only half followed, that's still a lot of calendar checking before bedtime. Imagine it. You roll over, face your spouse, and whisper, "Is it a feast day?" She frowns, trying to remember. "Wasn't St. Mildred's yesterday?" you ask. "No, that was St. Walpurga." "Wait, was today a fast?" And by the time you've figured it out, you're both too tired anyway. Fringe tidbit, in some regions, a few especially devout households kept notched wooden sticks marked with colored wax or carvings, indicating forbidden nights, sort of like a proto-boudoir calendar. One surviving example from northern France is color-coded with little notches shaped like bishop hats. Interpret that how you will. But what if you messed up? What if you forgot it was Ember Saturday and accidentally, well, did the thing? According to church teaching, the act itself became sinful, not because of lust or deviation, but because of timing. That was enough to merit confession and penance. A popular guide for priests outlined these moments in forensic detail. If the couple acted in ignorance? Moderate penance. If they knew the day was forbidden but did it anyway? Heavier penance may be several weeks of fasting, no meat, no ale, and no marital privileges. It's basically the medieval version of being grounded. And this brings us to a strange intersection of faith and fatigue, the idea that even desire on a forbidden day was risky. Some texts advised against even thinking lustfully during Lent, as it might tempt you to act, or, God forbid, have a sinful dream. Yes, we'll get to dreams in another section. One story from a 13th century abbey tells of a farmer who confessed to embracing his wife on the eve of St. Luke. The priest assigned him 3 days of bread and water, and no marital bed for a week. The farmer's response, preserved in the monk's notes? But she was cold and I was already under the blanket. Relatable. Now, let's turn to the sensory world again. You're lying in the dark. The room smells of peat smoke, candle wax, and roasted onions. There's a faint murmur of livestock breathing outside. You feel the warmth of someone beside you, and you know, somewhere in your bones, that you're supposed to be keeping track of saints, martyrs, and ecclesiastical seasons. But the heart? It doesn't run on church bells. And that's where tension lived in this system, not in blatant rebellion, but in the slow, soft collision between human affection and divine scheduling. Some confessors recognized this tension. A few advised leniency for older couples, or for those too poor to afford separate sleeping arrangements. Others encouraged long prayers and abstinence for everyone, regardless of age or inclination. The body was always seen as suspicious. The spirit needed constant reminders to stay in charge. So what about weddings? Surely that was a sanctioned time? Well, yes and no. Marriages during Advent and Lent were discouraged. If a couple married during these times, they might be required to delay consummation until after the season ended. That's right, weeks, even months, of chaste cuddling while the calendar caught up with your honeymoon. Fringe fact, in certain parts of England, local clergy kept actual scrolls called Libri Saborum et Carnalium, books of food and flesh, which tracked not only dietary restrictions during fasts, but also sexual abstinence rules. Imagine checking a scroll to see if you're allowed to touch your spouse. Sorry, love, the book says no tonight. It's meatless and meaningless until Sunday. Let's not overlook the subtle hypocrisy here. High-ranking clergy, especially bishops and abbots, were often rumored to ignore these same rules in private. Letters between monasteries occasionally hinted at special exceptions or times of grace granted to wealthy patrons. As always, privilege softened the edges of penance. You turn your head on the pillow and imagine what it meant for an average person, someone with calloused hands and a sore back, who spent every day surviving, to have to chart not only crops and weather, but also divine approval for love. The stars are bright tonight, glittering past the smoky haze. You imagine medieval lovers pointing at constellations, hoping Orion didn't mean it was St. Swithin's Eve, or some other day where warmth was forbidden. There's something tragic and beautiful about it. That love could be so persistent, so ordinary, that it still blossomed in the soil of such restriction. You imagine a husband and wife lying together in silence, hearts full, hands barely touching, just waiting for sunrise and the return of a liturgical green light. And so, as your eyelids grow heavier, know this, even in a world ruled by holy calendars, even in a life lived under the long shadow of penance, the human heart never quite surrendered. It bent. It bargained. It whispered. But it never gave up. The room is still. Outside, the wind has calmed, and in the lull, you hear the tiny scritch of a beetle moving across the hearthstone. Inside, the silence deepens, not empty, but full of all the things that aren't being said aloud. That's fitting, because tonight you enter the part of the medieval world where whispers ruled, dreams were dangerous, and the devil, apparently, had a real interest in your bedtime. Let's lift the blanket gently and take a look at the invisible guests some medieval folks believed were lying there with you. Yes, tonight is about demons, dreams, and the kind of nighttime worries that make you wish for simpler sins, like overeating lentils. Mainstream fact, many people in the 13th century genuinely believed that demons could influence your dreams, especially sexual ones. The term nocturnal emission wasn't just a physiological phenomenon, it was a moral puzzle. If something happened while you were asleep, were you to blame? Theologians debated it. Priests counseled over it. And in the meantime, the devil got busy in the margins of a lot of monastic manuscripts. Let's start with those dreams. If you had one that involved carnal thoughts, or, worse, specific people, the church took it seriously. Especially if the result was something physical. One confessor's manual advised priests to determine whether the sleeper had consented in the dream. Try parsing that with no Freud to guide you. And if you're wondering, but wait, how could someone be held responsible for something they did while asleep? Welcome to one of the strangest corners of medieval moral theology. Historians still argue whether this belief was widespread or mostly confined to more scholastic circles. But there's no doubt that nocturnal emissions, known as pollutions, were seen as suspect, if not necessarily sinful, then at least fishy. A potential sign of spiritual weakness. A leak in the soul's roof, if you will. Some monks were so distressed by these nighttime mishaps that they slept sitting up, or even standing, using ropes and wall hooks to avoid horizontal temptation. It's believed that some monasteries had sleeping cells designed to minimize contact with bedclothes. You lie there in your own blanket now, deeply grateful that your mattress doesn't judge you. Fringe tidbit: a 13th century monastic text from England tells of Brother H, who became convinced that a succubus, a female demon, was visiting him in the night. He insisted the demon wore a nun's veil and smelled of honey. The abbot reportedly responded with more fasting, cold baths, and a complete ban on spicy foods. Which brings us neatly to the idea that certain foods caused sinful dreams. Garlic, onions, wine, too much cheese, these could all supposedly stir the humors and make your dreams too lively. One penitential even recommends avoiding bitter herbs and fish with eggs during Lent, as they might rouse passions in the blood. You can almost hear medieval couples setting aside their soup, sighing, "We'll just have porridge." Now let's talk about the devil himself, or rather, his staff. In the spiritual imagination of 1250, demons were everywhere, lurking in corners, crouching on bed frames, whispering into ears. They weren't just symbols, they were practical explanations. Why did someone suddenly feel temptation? A demon. Why did you wake up ashamed and damp? Demon. Why was your neighbor unusually cranky on a Sunday morning? Well, guess. But it gets more specific. Some believed that demons, particularly incubi and succubi, could not only tempt but physically interact with humans. They were thought to steal seed or implant ideas, often during sleep. One popular story circulated about a knight who claimed to have fathered a child with a demoness. The child, according to some versions, later became a heretical preacher. Coincidence? In case you're wondering how people protected themselves, here's your 13th century toolkit for avoiding nighttime temptation. Pray before bed, at least a pater noster, preferably 3. Avoid strong-smelling food or wine. Sleep on your side, face toward the wall, ideally. Keep a relic nearby, bones of saints, pieces of holy cloth, or a twig from a known pilgrimage site. Do not sleep naked. Temptation enters through the skin. And above all, confess quickly if something happens. One curious cleric even recommended hanging a small bell from the bedframe. Not to ward off demons, but to alert your confessor in case of a morally ambiguous dream. Can you imagine? You roll over, knock the bell, and suddenly your priest is knocking on your door with a candle and a quill. You try not to laugh out loud in bed. After all, you wouldn't want to wake the goat. But the image stays with you. And now, the open scholarly debate: did people truly believe demons were physically involved, or was this just symbolic language for mental and moral struggle? Some scholars argue that the demon was a metaphor, a way of externalizing guilt or desire. Others insist that, for many, the presence of demons was literal, terrifying, and deeply real. And that belief had consequences. For monks, it could mean fasting, isolation, or even corporal punishment after a single dream. For married couples, it meant one more reason to feel unsure about affection, because if a kiss led to a dream, and the dream led to something warm, you might have let the devil in through the bedroom window. But let's not pretend this world was humorless. Even the manuals, grim as they are, contain faint smirks between the lines. One confessor notes that a man claimed to be seized by spirits nightly, and the priest advised a blanket of coarser wool and a different sleeping cap. It's the medieval equivalent of try drinking less wine and maybe stop watching whatever it is that gives you ideas. Sensory time again. Your room is cool now, but not cold. Your blanket is heavy in a comforting way, like a safe roof over your thoughts. You picture that ancient world where everything, your food, your dreams, your sleeping position, was thought to affect your soul. It was exhausting, yes. But also, in its own strange way, reassuring. Because everything meant something. You weren't just drifting through life, you were navigating a spiritual ocean, guided by prayers, priests, and the occasional bedroom demon. So, tonight, as you tuck your feet in and turn your face to the wall, just in case, take a moment to be thankful. Not that demons aren't real, but that you don't have to sleep sitting up to avoid them. You're still lying in the dark, cocooned in wool, safe from the whims of demons and spicy herbs. But now, your thoughts drift upward, quite literally. Because even though demons were said to crouch at the foot of your bed, hovering nearby were other, loftier onlookers, angels. And they, too, had opinions. Tonight, we gently float into the uncomfortable but oddly poetic belief that angels watched over the marital bed, not just to protect, but to evaluate. Silent spectators, hovering with quills ready, jotting notes not only on your prayers, but on what you were doing under those itchy blankets. Mainstream fact, the medieval church taught that angels were omnipresent, and that their role wasn't limited to singing hosannas or delivering messages to prophets. They were also spiritual witnesses to your conduct, your choices, your lapses, and yes, even your bedroom etiquette. A concept known as custos, or guardian angel, meant that each person had a celestial companion who observed their daily life and reported it upward. And that included knights. According to various writings from monastic scholars and preachers of the 12th and 13th centuries, angels were present in moments of temptation as well as triumph. If you resisted sin, they rejoiced. If you succumbed? Well, they looked away in sorrow, or so the teaching went. Some texts describe angels covering their faces with wings when witnessing morally suspect behavior. And yes, that included acts between spouses that strayed from the approved mode of missionary modesty. You roll onto your back and imagine it, you and your spouse in bed, side by side, quiet and content, and directly above, a slightly disappointed angel, shaking their head gently, perhaps offering you a mental note that next time, you should have waited until after Vespers. Fringe tidbit, one sermon preserved from the Rhineland around 1240 features a warning to husbands, beware that in your lust, the angels may take flight, and the demons come laughing in their place. That's quite the Yelp review from heaven, 0 stars, too much movement, smelled like garlic, would not attend again. But angelic presence wasn't all about judgment. There were also writings that framed them as protectors, especially against temptation or interference. You were encouraged to invoke your guardian angel when you felt desire stirring at the wrong time, or when dreams crept toward dangerous terrain. Angels were there to help you resist, to comfort your soul as your body wrestled with its more impulsive urges. Let's not forget that prayer before bed was central to all of this. Not just to protect from demons, but to align yourself with the angels. A popular bedtime prayer translated into Middle English began, "Angel bright, stay near this night, shield my thoughts till morning's light." It was a spiritual electric fence, inviting angels to hover and demons to flee. You'd murmur it with eyes closed, hoping that holiness hung in the rafters like good air. Now, imagine again that married couple, simple, devout, exhausted. They say their prayers, kiss each other on the cheek, and slide under their shared blanket. They're allowed to be intimate, it's Tuesday, after all, but they pause. Do you think the angel is watching? One asks, half joking. Maybe he's on his break, the other replies, smiling sleepily. Because even in 1250, people had their doubts. The idea of celestial surveillance sparked both reverence and quiet rebellion. Did angels really watch everything? Did they whisper to God about small moments of love and laughter? Or were they more like heavenly hall monitors, floating through existence with clipboards and very poor boundaries. Historians still argue whether this angelic witness was believed literally by most laypeople or was more of a metaphor for conscience. Some argue that for deeply devout individuals, especially those in monastic life, the angel was a real presence, nearly tangible. For others, especially peasants with more immediate concerns like blisters, livestock, and getting through Lent without collapsing, the idea of angelic bedroom auditors may have been more symbolic, a gentle reminder to stay morally upright, even when lying down. Either way, it shaped behavior. It made people cautious. It infused the most intimate moments with a strange, invisible audience. And it offered one more layer of spiritual meaning to the act of simply curling up beside someone you loved. Fringe visual. In a French illustrated manuscript from the early 14th century, there's a depiction of two angels peeking through parted bed curtains, one smiling encouragingly, the other holding a scroll that says simply, "Not tonight." The scribe may have had a sense of humor, or perhaps a few unsorted feelings about his own guardian angel's job description. Let's take a sensory walk through this spiritual surveillance system. The room smells of warm linen and cooling firewood. You're half asleep, hand tucked beneath the pillow, and a quiet part of you wonders if the silence above your bed is actually filled with wings. Not flapping or noisy, just present. Like the hush before a choir begins. The theology of angels wasn't punitive for everyone. Some couples felt comforted by it. There was peace in the idea that you weren't alone, that someone cared enough to guard your soul even as your body dozed or stirred. It made intimacy feel part of something bigger, something heavenly, even if the manual strongly suggested you keep things very, very grounded. Let's also be honest, some clergy definitely overdid it. A few sermons from the period lean hard into shame. If the angel sees you give yourself to sin, one fiery Dominican wrote, he shall mark you as one estranged from grace, and walk apart from you thereafter. Talk about being ghosted by your guardian angel. And yet, for every harsh warning, there's a quieter theology beneath it, that humans are complicated, and angels, if they do keep watch, understand that. They've seen it all. They know the difference between a moment of weakness and a lifetime of malice. Maybe they cover their eyes not in horror but in respect for privacy. Maybe they're rooting for you, hoping you'll get better at navigating this strange terrain of flesh and faith. You pull the blanket a little higher. Outside, a breeze stirs again, and you think about all the people, across centuries, who tried to live rightly under invisible eyes. The pressure was real, but so was the yearning. To be seen and still loved. To falter and still be guarded. To share warmth and not lose your soul in the process. Maybe the angels weren't keeping score. Maybe they were just keeping you company. The fire's gone completely now. Just a faint warmth lingers in the stones, like the echo of an old conversation. And it's fitting, because tonight, you're going to hear a few more of those old, whispered confessions. Some real, some imagined, some scribbled in the margins by nervous priests unsure whether they were helping souls or simply learning far more than they ever wanted to know. You're stepping into the low-lit booth of the medieval confessional. A creaking wooden screen between penitent and priest. A breath held. And then, quietly, haltingly, everything comes out. Mainstream fact, by the 13th century, confession had become not just a recommended practice but a requirement for the faithful. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 mandated that every Christian confess at least once per year. And with that came an entirely new level of pastoral intimacy. Priests became spiritual advisors, sin listeners, and especially when it came to the bedroom, awkwardly underqualified counselors. Picture it, a weary farmer kneels on straw-covered stone, nervously whispering to his parish priest. He's been married for 10 years. He loves his wife. But they may have, just once or twice, strayed from the standard routine. Maybe they laughed. Maybe she was on top. Maybe it was the night before a saint's day. And now, he isn't sure what he's done, but he's sure it wasn't good. And the priest? He opens a thick book, often a penitential or a confessor's guide, flips to the appropriate page, and begins diagnosing this very domestic crisis like it's a question of divine algebra. Fringe tidbit, one surviving Anglo-Norman confessional manual contains a table where various bed sins are ranked in severity. Intercourse on feast day gets 10 days of penance. Inverted position with the woman astride receives 40 days. Emission outside the vessel of marriage, that's the actual wording, can carry a season-long fast. You can practically see a monk muttering, "Oh no, not that one again." This is where things get awkward, for the priests, especially. Many were young, celibate, and raised in monasteries with minimal real-world experience. And now, they were suddenly responsible for assessing the fine points of marital fumbling. One 13th-century priest scribbled a note in the margin of his manual, "When the baker came to confess again, I could not help but look at his hands." It's unclear whether that means judgment, admiration, or simply confusion. But it says something about the personal impact of these conversations. Confession was not anonymous back then. You knew your priest. He likely baptized your children, blessed your crops, and yes, now knew the frequency and geometry of your bedroom habits. That's a level of familiarity even most modern therapists would avoid. And yet, people did confess. They believed it mattered. That absolution brought peace. That penance brought spiritual reset. And if that meant describing in detail a Tuesday evening mistake involving enthusiastic pillow talk, then so be it. Let's walk into one of these booths together, metaphorically, of course. The air smells of wax, wet wool, and fear. The priest leans forward. You whisper, "We were married, but we did not lie face to face." There's a pause. He clears his throat. Was it feast day? You blink. I don't think so. He nods. Say 5 paternosters, fast from meat until Sunday, and remember, face to face. Eyes closed. Angels watching. And that's a fairly lenient outcome. Some confessors took a more aggressive approach. A manual from the Iberian Peninsula includes a passage where a penitent was required to sleep on bare floorboards for a week after describing laughter during coupling. Laughter. As if joy were an affront to divine solemnity. Fringe anecdote, in a manuscript from Picardy, a priest recounts hearing a woman confess that she invoked the names of saints during the act. The priest, shocked, made her wear a rough linen shift for a month and attend mass barefoot. She reportedly responded, it helped him finish. The priest left no further comment. And here we come to our scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these confessions were rigidly processed or treated with human nuance. Were priests acting like divine accountants, tallying sins and issuing fines? Or were they, at least some of them, genuinely trying to offer compassion, to help their flock navigate the difficult terrain of body and belief? Evidence points both ways. Some records show strict uniform penances. Others include scribbled prayers, reassurances, even jokes. One confessor added in Latin, "Let the man do penance, but also let him be hugged." It was not the worst thing. The line between absurdity and grace was often very thin. Now, picture a married couple walking home after confession. They're quiet, reflective. One of them is still chewing over the idea that their last Friday embrace may have disturbed the angels. But they also feel lighter. They've said their piece. They've received their sentence. And now they know, wait until Sunday. Keep the candles out. No more quoting saints. You lie there now, pulling your blanket up around your shoulders. The idea of confession has changed, softened in your modern world. But back then, it was a lifeline, a kind of moral bath that people took regularly, awkwardness and all. Imagine the weight of knowing your confessor remembered what you said last time. That every year, you'd likely return with some variation of the same sleepy sin. That you'd have to say it again, maybe with different words, maybe with a little more embarrassment. And yet, you did. You kept coming. Because you believed the soul needed cleaning, like a hearth swept of ash. And the priests? Perhaps they sighed. Perhaps they raised eyebrows. But in their own way, they too participated in the long, strange miracle of forgiveness. They listened, as best they could. They tried to help. So tonight, as your breath slows and the last sounds of the day fade into shadow, think of those wooden booths, those whispered sins, those crooked smiles behind the screen. And remember that even in a world full of rules, there were people doing their best to love, to laugh, and to make peace with their own humanity. Even if it meant saying, "Forgive me, Father. We tried something new." You're nearly asleep now, your body slack, your mind floating like a leaf in a still pond. But before you drift too far, tonight's story slips you into a quieter corner of the cloister. A place where scrolls multiply, ink stains fingers, and candles flicker over parchment thick with secrets. You're about to follow the monks who knew far too much about things they were never supposed to do. Yes, tonight we tiptoe into the study cells and scriptoriums of the church's own rule-makers, the monastic scholars and scribes who built the bedroom doctrine from behind cloister walls. Celibate. Solitary. Often exhausted. And still writing, in painful detail, about precisely how married couples should, well, proceed. Mainstream fact, many of the church's most influential writings on sexual ethics came not from bishops in cathedrals or married laypeople in town, but from monks. Celibate, devout, often cloistered for life, these men created confessional manuals, theological treatises, and even private letters that outlined, in excruciating, and often unintendedly hilarious, detail, the rules of medieval intimacy. And these monks weren't casual about their task. They saw their work as sacred, shaping souls, refining virtue, preserving divine order. But the irony? Their lives were utterly removed from the messy, noisy, affectionate reality of the marriage bed. Fringe tidbit: one Cistercian monk named Hildebert of Lavardin wrote passionately about marital duty while also admitting he'd never laid eyes on a wife uncloaked. Yet his scrolls outlined the correct rhythm of marital contact, no more than once a week, preferably on Sunday afternoon, the necessary prayers, and a somewhat bizarre prohibition against tickling the feet with undue mirth. You chuckle softly. Tickling. Forbidden, apparently. Let's set the scene. You're a young monk, cloistered at 20, cloaked in wool, hunched over your desk in the scriptoria. Outside, the snow piles quietly against the walls. Inside, your job today is to copy and update a confessor's manual, a handbook that lists which acts are licit, which aren't, and exactly how many days of barley and water fasting each deserves. You've never been in a romantic relationship. You've never kissed anyone. But today, you must decide, is marital intimacy while standing more sinful than doing so during a fast day? Your answer matters. People will confess based on your wording. Priests will assign penance using your categories. No pressure. These monks weren't trying to make things absurd. They truly believed they were helping shape a moral world. But without first-hand knowledge, they relied on a potent mix of inherited doctrine, allegory, and, frequently, their own overactive imaginations. That's where things get interesting. Take Peter the Chanter, a Parisian theologian who helped define 12th-century Christian sexual ethics. He never married. He likely never kissed anyone either. But his writings dissected the concept of lustful intent with the precision of a surgeon. He defined acceptable positions, cautioned against too much vocalization, and warned that even within marriage, acts must be carried out in such a way that the angels remain unoffended. You picture him at his desk, trying to picture the angels. And this brings us to our scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these monastic authors truly grasped what they were legislating. Did they understand marriage as a dynamic, affectionate partnership, or as a necessary evil, barely tolerated for the sake of children? Were their writings practical guidance, or aspirational morality designed for a world that never really existed? Evidence again points both ways. Some texts are oddly tender. A few monks acknowledged the joys of companionship, the grace of partnership, the peace of growing old together. Others read like celestial instruction manuals, obsessed with hierarchy, obedience, and emotional detachment. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, of a monk who was so distressed by the impurity of copying sexual sin lists that he refused to touch the ink with his fingers, instead using a bone stylus to hold the quill. You picture him now, elbow up, stylus awkwardly perched, muttering prayers between every clause, scribbling things like, "The woman must not initiate with urgency, lest her soul be unbalanced." Imagine that, written by someone who's never seen a woman run, let alone flirt. And yet, for all their distance from the lived experience, some monks had surprising clarity. One scribe in York added a note beneath a long list of improper positions: "These seem much to memorize, and yet men forget their prayers far more often." You smile. Even cloistered minds knew when the whole thing felt a little much. Monasteries weren't free from contradiction. While officially celibate, many housed scandal, temptation, and longing. A few kept personal diaries, deeply private writings where monks confessed their dreams, their fears, and sometimes, their lusts. One Benedictine left behind a passage that simply reads, "I dreamt of a woman feeding birds by the river. I woke with guilt and hunger." The church might have considered it a minor failing. But the monk? He clearly felt something deeper, a sadness, maybe, or the ache of isolation. So tonight, as you lie wrapped in softness, consider the work of these scribes. Their fingers ink-stained, their candles burning low, their minds wrestling with temptation from within and stories from beyond. They tried to guide a world they didn't really inhabit. They did their best, armed with scripture, logic, and the occasional personal anecdote from someone else's confession. Fringe visual: one manuscript from a Burgundian monastery shows a bored-looking monk writing beside a tiny margin illustration of a devil dangling upside down from a bedpost, frowning at a couple kissing. The text simply reads, "Let not thy joy invite the tempter." But the devil, drawn like a sulky bat, looks more annoyed than tempted. These were men of faith. Men of structure. But also men of silence. Their words shaped generations of behavior, and yet, they themselves lived in stillness. It's hard not to wonder what they thought privately. If they questioned the rigidity. If they ever looked up from their parchment and imagined a warm bed, a quiet laugh, a soft good-night kiss. They never said. But perhaps that's why they wrote so much. The night presses in gently. You're deep under the covers now, limbs loose, brain somewhere between history and dream. But the story continues, this time in the flickering space where roles are assigned, expectations weigh heavy, and fairness feels more like a hope than a rule. Tonight, you walk quietly into the tangled world of gender roles, with extra guilt on top. Mainstream fact: in 1250, the church taught that men and women were spiritually equal in the eyes of God, but deeply unequal in the mechanics of sin. Particularly when it came to intimacy. Men were assumed to be the actors, the initiators, the moral guides. Women? The passive recipients, prone to temptation, and constantly in need of modesty reminders, preferably shouted from a pulpit by someone who'd never worn a dress. You shift on your pillow as the gender script unfolds. A husband, for example, was allowed, expected, to initiate the marital act. If he did so with restraint, on approved days, in the approved manner, and ideally while thinking of procreation, all was well. His desire was natural. Controlled, it was a virtue. Uncontrolled, well, that was where confession came in. A wife, however, had a narrower path. If she initiated, it was seen as suspect. Overly eager? That raised theological eyebrows. Too vocal? Even worse. If she enjoyed herself? That had to be carefully justified, ideally with a yes, but it was for the sake of children. Fringe tidbit: a 13th century confessor's manual out of Milan states that if a woman calls to her husband with the voice of appetite, she should do penance for 7 days. Not for what happened next, just for asking. That same manual, rather generously, notes that if she called to him for the sake of union alone, not lust, she may only need to fast 1 day instead. You take a breath. That's a lot to weigh before bedtime. The idea of desire was especially tricky. Men were expected to feel it, though not too much, and not in the wrong way. But women's desire? That was viewed with deep suspicion. Some writers, like the well-known monastic thinker Isidore of Seville, believed that women's sexual appetites were inherently more dangerous, more emotional, less logical, and therefore easier for the devil to manipulate. That's why so many sermons warned husbands to govern their wives not only in public matters, but in the bed as well. You imagine medieval husbands trying to translate that into real life. Lie down, dear. No, the other way. No laughing. Just think of angels. And here's the scholarly debate for the night. Historians still argue whether medieval women internalized these ideas or pushed back against them in private. Some evidence suggests many women believed in their spiritual equality and even asserted it in confession or council. Others conformed outwardly but carved out their own spaces of humor and rebellion behind closed doors. One record from a small priory in Devon shows a woman who confessed that she had corrected her husband's movements and was assigned penance. But she also reportedly added it was he who needed guidance. There's no further note from the priest. Maybe he agreed. But the inequality didn't stop at who could ask. It extended to who bore the blame when something went wrong. If a couple broke a bedroom rule, wrong time, wrong day, wrong position, the man might confess that he lost control. But if the woman enjoyed it or failed to resist, she was seen as doubly culpable, tempting and allowing herself to be tempted. This wasn't universal. Some confessional guides allowed for nuance. They recognized fatigue, affection, and even curiosity. But others, especially the stricter Benedictine influence ones, left very little room for grace. For women, even marriage wasn't always a shelter. It was a duty with a dress code, a script, and a mute button. Now let's talk about the theological concept of the weaker vessel. That phrase, first found in the Bible, later used often in sermons, was taken literally by many medieval writers. Women were physically and spiritually fragile. They needed protection. But they also needed management. And where better to manage someone than in the most private of places? One confessor's note reads, "If a man is tempted to speak words of heat to his wife, let him do so without rhyme or verse, and not in her tongue." That's a very polite way of saying, no dirty talk. And definitely no poetry. Especially not in a language she'll understand. You blink, thinking back to the poor troubadours. Troubadour poetry, written by courtly men in admiration of noble ladies, was full of longing, flattery, and affection. But it wasn't always welcome in the church's view. Why? Because it placed women in the role of inspiration. It acknowledged their beauty, their power, even their desires. And that upset the script. Women weren't supposed to inspire sin. Or lead. Or even notice that they were being admired. Fringe example, the bishop in Toulouse banned performances of love songs during Lent, claiming they excited the heart more than bread excites hunger. You wonder how many poets took that as a compliment. And what about older women? Widows, for example, or midwives, or wise women in the village. Their roles in the moral bedroom script were blurry. Some were respected. Others were feared. A few were quietly asked for advice behind the church's back. A few were accused of witchcraft when their herbs for comfort looked too effective. You lie quietly now, your blanket pulled just under your chin. You think about how tiring it must have been to be a woman in 1250. To love someone. To want them. To feel joy and worry in the same moment. To live under the expectation that your body was the gate of sin, and your silence a virtue. And yet, love happened anyway. There are letters from husbands who clearly adored their wives, who wrote of missing them, of longing not just for touch but for their voice. One merchant, away for a month, wrote, "I miss thy foot upon mine, and the way thy breath warms my chest in sleep." No theology there. Just affection. And women? They wrote too. In poems, in prayers, in margins. One noblewoman penned a note beside her book of hours that reads, "He sleeps like an ox and dreams nothing. I keep watch, I remember." You imagine her sitting up in bed, smiling wryly, candlelight catching the edge of her inkpot. Despite the rules, despite the unequal burdens, despite the constant reminders to be silent, modest, and still, women endured. And more than that, they shaped the silent resistance, with gestures, glances, jokes whispered behind hands. So tonight, as you curl deeper into the warmth of your own bed, think of those who had to navigate their wants through thickets of doctrine and expectation. Who carried guilt not for cruelty or betrayal, but for feeling, asking, smiling, touching. And know that even in a world ruled by angels and monks with ink-stained fingers, love found its way through. You're curled deep now, wrapped up tight, with the rhythm of your breath steady and low. But tonight's path winds through a quieter corner of medieval intimacy, one that starts not with rules or punishment, but with feeling. With love. With longing. And eventually, with penance. Tonight, you find yourself in the aftermath. In the quiet after the warmth. In the flickering space between passion and apology. This is where when passion met penance. Mainstream fact, the church never denied that passion existed. It didn't pretend love wasn't real. But it treated passion with suspicion, like a candle near a haystack. Love was acceptable. Marital duty was acceptable. But if you enjoyed it too much? If desire swept in like a spring flood and pulled you out of the liturgical lines? That's when things got complicated. You wake up beside your spouse in 12:50. The rooster hasn't crowed yet. There's just the soft rise of morning light, the smell of damp thatch, the warmth of someone's breath on your neck. And suddenly you remember, last night, you forgot the rules. It was Friday. A fast day. You were supposed to abstain. You said nothing, and neither did she. You just held each other close, and now, what? Now, confession. Quiet, awkward, necessary confession. Fringe tidbit, one penitent in a 13th century record confessed that he had clasped his wife with joy on a forbidden day and been struck afterward with a heaviness of soul. His priest assigned a penance of 7 days of silence and the psalms of repentance before sleep. That's a lot of quiet dinners. The whole system of sin and penance wasn't meant to crush love, it was meant to channel it. But sometimes, that channel narrowed so tightly that even a whisper of passion spilled out of bounds. And yet, people kept whispering. Let's visit a court case, not a criminal trial, but a church court. A marital dispute. These happened more than you'd think. One from 1243 involved a woman who complained her husband was refusing his debt. The debt wasn't money, it was marital obligation. In church doctrine, spouses owed each other not just fidelity, but physical intimacy. To deny it, unreasonably, was a sin. Even in a marriage full of restrictions, there was still space carved out for affection. But affection had to walk a narrow bridge between love and lust. One too many kisses, a glance held too long, a soft giggle in the wrong moment, and suddenly the scale tipped from virtue to vice. That brings us to the heart of this section. Penance wasn't just for strangers in the dark. Sometimes, it was shared between lovers. Picture it, a couple kneeling side by side in church, shoulder to shoulder, murmuring prayers of repentance not because they'd betrayed each other, but because they'd held each other too tightly on St. Cuthbert's Eve. You want to roll your eyes, but also, it's touching, isn't it? There's an open scholarly debate here, too. Did people really believe they needed forgiveness for every misstep? Or did they use confession and penance as a kind of emotional balm, something to soothe the afterburn of desire? Some historians suggest penance was part of the ritual, like a spiritual exhale. Others argue it was fear-driven, a constant chase for moral safety. The truth is probably both. People are layered, even under wool. And there were loopholes. Oh, were there loopholes? One priest, writing in Burgundy, noted that if a couple lost track of the calendar in mutual affection, their sin might be counted as unwilled. Another priest in Aragon wrote that intention counts greatly. If the heart is pure, the act may be weighed lighter. These were flickers of mercy in a system that often felt like moral bookkeeping. Fringe example, a married couple in Normandy was brought before a bishop after someone overheard them being very cheerful during a feast night. The bishop, instead of assigning public penance, told them to fast from each other's arms until the next rain. Which, depending on the season, could be a very short sentence indeed. Let's step away from the courts and return to the bedroom. It's cold. You both know what you did. You know what day it was. But neither of you feels sorry. Not really. Maybe you'll confess it next week. Maybe you'll light a candle and whisper a psalm together. Maybe you'll fast tomorrow. But tonight? You smile at each other in the dark. This tension between affection and guilt, desire and discipline, wasn't always harsh. Sometimes, it was almost sweet. Couples developed rhythms of repentance. They negotiated their own balance. One kissed the other goodnight and muttered, "St. Thomas will forgive us," like a bedtime joke. Love persisted. Even under scrutiny. Even beneath shame. And sometimes, it grew stronger because of the penance. Think of it this way: if the church was going to turn your marriage into a moral battleground, why not become allies in the war? Shared guilt was still shared. Shared prayers after the act became a new kind of closeness. Repenting together was its own strange intimacy. You sigh softly now, letting that thought settle. Fringe visual: in one marginal drawing found in a monastic handbook, a couple kneels in prayer, side by side. Behind them stands a tiny angel holding a candle. The caption, in Latin, reads, "They laughed too long, but prayed longer still." Maybe that was the church's dream. Or maybe it was the scribe's own quiet joke. Either way, that's where passion met penance, not in punishment, but in the fragile place where people tried to do right, even when they stumbled. Especially when they stumbled. So tonight, as your breath deepens and your eyes drift, know that love, real, warm, awkward love, has always lived in the tension between desire and discipline. And that sometimes, the softest prayers come not before the act, but after. Your body's still, your thoughts soft-edged. But the story shifts now from souls and sins to something surprisingly tangible. Fabric. Sheets. Shadows. Candle stubs. Because tonight, you don't step into the church or the courtroom, you step into the bedroom itself. Not in theory, but in texture. Tonight, it's all about bedspreads and modesty protocols. Mainstream fact: the medieval church didn't just prescribe moral rules, it promoted modesty as a visible discipline. This extended to the household, the bed, and even the precise way bodies were to be clothed, uncovered, and arranged when engaging in intimacy. In 1250, it wasn't enough to do the right thing in bed, you had to look like you were doing it modestly, too. And that meant linens. Nightshirts. Blankets. Candles. Silence. And a very delicate choreography of who moved when, and who was allowed to see what. Let's start with the cloth. For most people, a bed in 1250 consisted of a rope-tied wooden frame with a straw-stuffed mattress, covered in rough linen or wool. Wealthier couples had actual bedspreads, usually dyed fabric, sometimes even embroidered. But no matter how luxurious the bed, church teaching was clear: don't let it become a stage. Keep the body covered. Let modesty cloak even your most private duties. Fringe tidbit: a 13th century manual from the Rhineland specifies that during marital intimacy, the loins may be uncovered only so far as is necessary, and should be recovered with haste after. The word haste is underlined. Apparently, a breeze was enough to offend heaven. And it wasn't just the sheets. Night clothes mattered. A confessor's guide from England instructs couples to keep their night tunics on, long, loose garments usually tied with a simple cord. Nakedness, even in marriage, was the invitation of sin. One bishop went as far as to call nude intimacy the devil's disguise for warmth. Which brings us to candles. You might think flickering candlelight is romantic, medieval slow jam, if you will. But to the church? Dangerous. Vision led to desire. Desire led to distraction. So, many priests advised that couples extinguish all lights before beginning any act of union. No looking. Just duty. One sermon even warned, the eye tempts the hand invites the heart offends the Lord. You wonder if that priest had ever been hugged. But did people follow these rules? Here comes your scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these modesty protocols were enforced outside of monasteries. Some believe rural couples ignored them entirely, relying on their own traditions. Others suggest that modesty, even if not enforced by priests, was deeply embedded in village culture, taught from mother to daughter, wife to wife. You stretch under your own blanket now, thinking about how heavy those medieval quilts must have been, woven thick to fight the cold, tucked in tight to hide every limb. A blanket wasn't just for comfort. It was a kind of moral armor. Keep covered, and you were protected from both chill and sin. Let's zoom in on one couple. They're in their mid-30s, married 12 years. It's early spring, and the wind's been bitter all day. Their children are finally asleep on pallets nearby. The fire's out. They're both under the blanket. He reaches for her hand, quietly. She responds, just as quietly. And then, as they've been taught, they move slowly, keeping their nightclothes mostly on. No speaking. No laughter. Just breath and warmth in the dark. You feel tenderness there, not shame, not fear, but a shared effort to be good. To be safe. But not everyone was quite so careful. Some people let the rules slip. Fringe anecdote: a court record from Flanders mentions a woman brought before a local cleric for boasting that she wore nothing at all in bed, not even on fast days. Her neighbor overheard and reported her. The woman was sentenced to public prayer and temporary exclusion from communion. She reportedly responded, "My husband sleeps warmer for it." No word on what the husband thought. Even in monasteries, modesty rules were detailed. Monks and nuns were instructed to sleep fully clothed, often in their day robes, with their hands outside their blankets. Some monks even bound their hands with cords at night to avoid wayward touching. It was a world of layers, literal and metaphorical. Cover the skin. Guard the soul. But even then, you could feel the resistance. The quiet human pushback. Because cloth wears thin. Candles flicker. Laughter happens. And sometimes, just sometimes, people wanted to see each other. One priest's marginalia reads, "A man confessed to having gazed lovingly upon his wife's face during the act. I told him to consider it as looking upon a relic, briefly and with reverence." You try not to giggle under your own covers. It's oddly poetic, in a sermon-why sort of way. The idea that the face was too intimate to view during passion. That's a whole other level of modesty. And yet, it speaks volumes about the era's anxieties. Flesh led to feeling. Feeling led to falling. So better to dim the lights, smooth the sheets, and pretend it was all ceremonial. Yet despite all this modesty talk, not everyone agreed. Some theologians believed marital intimacy could still be affectionate, even beautiful. A handful of confessors' manuals suggest that gentle words and holy companionship were acceptable during the act, as long as things didn't get too enthusiastic. These guides acknowledged that love and modesty weren't opposites, they just had to share the blanket. Fringe visual: a manuscript from northern Italy shows a married couple in bed, their heads touching gently, eyes closed. A saint hovers nearby, holding a scroll that says, "Be not too swift, nor too slow, and keep the covers drawn." It's half prayer, half parental advice. You turn onto your side, blanket tucked under your chin. Maybe these modesty rules weren't just about shame. Maybe they were also about reverence. About believing the body mattered. That even in your most private, instinctual moments, you were in dialogue with something sacred. So tonight, as your eyes flutter closed, remember, beneath all the layers of fabric, of doctrine, of silence, people still touched. Still loved. Still reached for each other in the dark. And while the rules changed how they moved, they never quite silenced the desire to be close. Just, don't forget to blow out the candle. You're warm now, nearly weightless beneath your blanket. The quiet hum of the night has settled into your ears like a lullaby. But just as your thoughts begin to float off, something a little unexpected nudges its way into the story. Tonight, the tale takes a sideways step into the realm of animals, allegories, and instructional metaphors so strange and specific, you'll swear someone made them up after a long, sleepless night in the scriptorium. But no, these were real. Earnest, awkward, and wildly imaginative. Welcome to the part of church teaching where moral guidance came courtesy of extremely confused oxen, slightly traumatized geese, and a whole barnyard of creatures drafted into theological service. Mainstream fact: medieval sermons, especially those meant for the general public, often used animal metaphors to explain moral lessons. This included instructions on marital behavior. Why? Because people remembered stories better than rules. And nothing stuck in the mind like being told not to move in the manner of a goat. Actual quote. Preachers leaned heavily on the natural world to communicate spiritual ideas. Animals were seen as examples, both to emulate and avoid. The lion, proud and noble. The dove, pure and faithful. The pig, slovenly and lustful. You get the idea. And in the bedroom? These metaphors were everywhere. Fringe tidbit: one widely circulated 13th century sermon advised couples to avoid the leaping of the stag, the crouching of the cat, and the rooting of the hog. You lie there, blinking into the dark, trying to imagine any of those being especially romantic. The point, of course, was to discourage overly energetic or inventive behavior. The ideal intimacy was calm, controlled, and, according to some monks, vaguely cow-like, predictable, docile, and always facing the right direction. But some comparisons got strangely personal. One preacher in Wales warned his parishioners never to emulate the slyness of the fox, who approaches in silence and departs in haste. You imagine that delivered with a straight face from the pulpit. At a Sunday morning mass. In front of children. And the metaphors weren't always about movement. Sometimes, they were about sound. Another text cautions against moaning like a dove, not because of the noise itself, but because it reveals the stirrings of flesh and invites the ear of Satan. You roll your eyes. Poor doves. Just trying to exist. Here's your scholarly debate of the night. Some historians argued these animal comparisons were metaphorical, never meant to be taken literally. Others point to repeated appearances in penitential manuals and sermon collections as evidence that they were considered genuine guides. Either way, medieval preachers clearly had strong opinions about your posture and your poultry impressions. Let's not forget the ox. The ox. A favorite in both biblical symbolism and agricultural reality. Strong, slow, and loyal. One confessor's guide praises the labor of the ox, steady and without disorder. That same guide warns couples not to imitate the rooster, who struts and shouts and gives no care to timing. You make a mental note: be the ox, not the rooster. And while we're on barnyard comparisons, we must mention the goose. In one particularly vivid passage, a 13th century preacher warns against flapping like the goose, which moves too much before settling. This was apparently a dig at foreplay. The same sermon adds that those who tarry too long in warming their flesh become food for the devil's pot. You're not sure what that means, but it's enough to make you tuck your limbs more neatly under the blanket. Animal allegories even found their way into visual art. In a manuscript from Burgundy, there's a marginal illustration of a goat standing on its hind legs, holding a candle. Next to it, a monk writes, "He who moves too freely lights a fire not of God." Was it literal? Symbolic? A joke? Possibly all three. You smile. For all their piety, these scribes had wild imaginations. The deeper purpose behind these animal metaphors was, of course, to anchor spiritual ideas in familiar experience. Everyone in the 13th century knew what animals looked like. They watched them daily. So when a priest said, "Let not the husband leap as a stag startled in the field," the entire congregation probably nodded, picturing something both hilarious and instantly understandable. Still, some advice was less helpful. Fringe example: a scribe in a northern Italian manual wrote that the couple must not emulate the serpent, who coils and twists with deception. There's no indication what act this was referring to, but the mental image alone is enough to make a monk drop his quill. These comparisons didn't just shape behavior, they shaped how people thought about intimacy. If your body was always being compared to beasts, sometimes gentle, sometimes grotesque, it was hard to imagine the act as sacred. It became something to be managed. Tolerated. At best, kept quiet and orderly. And yet, people found their own ways to push back. One marginal note, clearly written by a lay reader, not a monk, responds to a sermon's animal metaphor with a scribble, "But what if the goose loves the goat?" You chuckle. It's a joke, obviously, but also a protest. A refusal to let everything be flattened into fear. Because animals aren't always wild. Sometimes they nuzzle. Sometimes they stay close for warmth. Sometimes they mate for life. One forgotten scribe from Normandy tried to reclaim the metaphors. He wrote, "Let the husband be as the horse who returns always to his stable, and the wife as the bird who finds no nest sweeter than her own." It's corny, sure. But it's also tender. And in a world of roaring stags and scolding roosters, that tenderness feels revolutionary. So tonight, as you drift, picture your medieval counterpart. Lying beside their spouse, thinking of the priest's warnings, trying not to move like a fox, and wondering, deep down, what love is supposed to look like when it's wrapped in so many rules. And maybe, just maybe, they reach for a hand in the dark and decide, for once, to let the goose do what it wants. The air is still now. Your thoughts slow. But your journey isn't done, not quite. You've seen bedrooms lit by candles and watched monks write about things they never did. You've learned what happens when passion meets penance and when angels peek through bed curtains. But tonight, you're leaving the village cottage. Tonight, you pack a bundle, step into your sandals, and join the open road. Because this time, we're following the pilgrims, the travelers, and the lonelier wanderers, those who stepped beyond parish borders and found that moral geography gets complicated. This is the world of pilgrims, prostitutes, and purgatory loopholes. Mainstream fact: in 1250, movement, physical travel across regions, was a fact of life for many. Whether to visit a shrine, flee war, trade goods, or escape a scandal, people were constantly on the move. Pilgrimages were especially common, and with them came a strange paradox: the holier the destination, the messier the road. Church teaching held pilgrimage as a sacred act, a journey of penance and prayer. But it also created a liminal space, one where people stepped outside the strict confines of village routine. And when people stepped out of bounds, their behavior often followed. Let's talk pilgrims first. A man walking from York to Canterbury might travel for weeks, sleep in barns, eat little, pray much, and, every so often, encounter temptation. The church knew this. That's why many pilgrimage sermons included explicit warnings: beware the women of crossroads and inns, who sell both ale and sin. They didn't mean that figuratively. Fringe tidbit: a penitential manual from northern France lists a special section for sins committed while en route to holy sites. The sins included intercourse with women for payment, impure thoughts while gazing upon statues, and lying beside a fellow traveler for warmth with no chaste intention. That last one sounds suspiciously autobiographical. And the women of the road? Some were indeed sex workers, many with no choice, driven by poverty or widowhood. Others were camp followers or innkeepers' daughters. And still others were pilgrims themselves, trying to complete the same holy journey, but treated with suspicion all the same. Here's the real contradiction: while the church discouraged sexual behavior on the road, it often turned a blind eye. Pilgrims, after all, were doing something holy. If they stumbled a bit on the way, wasn't that part of the path? Historians still argue whether this leniency was official policy or unofficial pragmatism. Some bishops preached harshly against sins of the road. Others quietly instructed priests to focus more on confession at the destination than the missteps along the way. Let's shift now to brothels. In towns along pilgrimage routes, Chartres, Santiago, even small stops like Conques, brothels often operated with semi-official status. They were regulated, taxed, and, in some cases, protected by the very church that condemned their purpose. Why? Because suppression often led to chaos. Regulation, on the other hand, kept things orderly. You blink in the dark. Is this the same church that scolded couples for spooning on fast days? Yes. And that's the complexity. Public sin, if managed, was more tolerable than private chaos. One bishop even wrote that brothels were the sores of the city, unpleasant but necessary. Charming, no? Fringe example, in Bologna, the church granted indulgences, yes, spiritual rewards, to patrons who donated to houses of penitent women, which often were just renamed brothels with rules. No services on holy days. No underage girls. And ideally, no laughing too loudly. But what about purgatory? That ever-present spiritual purgatory, dangling just past the edge of life? Here's where loopholes appear. Pilgrimage could earn you indulgences, spiritual credits, so to speak. If you completed the journey, attended Mass at a shrine, confessed your sins, and lit the right candles, you could shave time off your post-mortem purification. For some, this became a bargaining tool. Yes, I slipped on the way, they'd say. But I reached Compostela. I walked the whole road barefoot. Surely that makes up for a night or two of Dera. And the church? Sometimes, it agreed. There's your scholarly debate tonight. Did this indulgence system promote leniency? Did it accidentally encourage sin, as long as people knew they could balance the scale later? Some historians say yes, that people saw pilgrimage as a kind of moral exchange. Others argue that fear of hell still held sway, that slips on the road haunted travelers long after they returned. You roll onto your back, thinking of all those travelers. Not just men. Women, too. There are records of widows walking hundreds of miles to shrines. Of teenage girls dressed as boys to join pilgrimage groups. Of married couples who found unexpected freedom on the road, and sometimes, unexpected trouble. And in the middle of it all? Confessors. Pop-up booths in abbey courtyards. Priests stationed outside shrines, prepared to hear the sins of the footsore faithful. And always, the same questions: did you stay chaste on the road? Did you keep your thoughts pure? Did you resist the wine and the dancing and the soft eyes of strangers? Sometimes yes. Often no. But by the end of the journey, if you confessed and repented, you could still light your candle. Still kneel before the relic. Still hope that heaven counted the miles more than the mistakes. Fringe visual, in a manuscript from northern Spain, a pilgrim is shown kissing the statue of St. James. Behind him, two angels tally coins on a scroll. A demon peeks from the corner, holding a parchment that reads, "What of the girl at the inn?" The caption beneath says, "The saint intercedes, but remembers all." So tonight, as your breath deepens and the world narrows to warmth and softness, picture those travelers. Cloaks pulled tight, feet blistered, hearts heavy. Some holy, some hopeful, some only half convinced. But all walking toward grace, one slow step at a time. And if they stumbled along the way? Maybe that, too, was part of the pilgrimage. The world is hushed now, like parchment waiting for ink. You've walked alongside pilgrims, peeked beneath blankets, heard angelic sighs and barnyard scoldings. But now, tonight, we open a door most folks weren't even supposed to know existed. A door to a room filled with forbidden books and illustrations with too much detail. Yes, welcome to the secret reading list of 1,250, the books behind the books. The ones clergy whispered about, scribes nervously copied, and bishops occasionally locked away behind actual keys. Mainstream fact, while the medieval church publicly preached restraint and modesty, there existed, within monasteries and theological centers, a set of texts that said quite a bit more. Confessional manuals, penance lists, moral treatises, and occasionally, obscure works of medicine, all delved into topics that, frankly, make you raise an eyebrow in the candlelight. And sometimes, those texts included illustrations. Fringe tidbit: a preserved manuscript in a Parisian archive includes a series of careful ink drawings meant to help confessors identify specific marital deviations. Each scene is labeled, never sensational, always clinical, but unmistakable. One even includes a note in Latin that roughly translates to, "for education of the wise and not the eyes of the curious." Which is a fancy way of saying, please don't show this to the altar boys. Let's pull back for a second. These books weren't intended to titillate. They were created as guides, for priests hearing confessions, for monks educating novices, and sometimes for theologians debating the exact boundaries of sin. But that didn't stop them from being detailed. Diagrams. Marginalia. Even metaphors so vivid they may as well have been sketches. Some texts were written in Latin so dense it acted as its own censorship. Only the educated could read them. Others were locked away, literally, inside chained libraries, accessible only to clerics of a certain rank. And even then, often only with permission. You imagine a nervous young deacon fumbling with a key, opening a creaking cabinet, and pulling out a volume bound in cracked leather. Inside, chapter headings read, De Peccatis Carnis, on the sins of the flesh. No pictures yet. Just long, winding paragraphs on angles, intentions, spiritual metaphors, and, surprisingly often, the appropriate length of postcoital prayer. But in the margins? That's where the curiosity lived. One Benedictine scribe, possibly bored or just a little too invested, began adding tiny ink drawings beside the more complex sections. Not graphic, not vulgar, but incredibly specific. A couple, clothed, positioned stiffly according to church norms. Then, in a different corner of the page, same couple, reversed roles, small devil peeking around a curtain. The implication was clear: this version? Not approved. And yet, someone drew it. And someone kept copying it. There's your scholarly debate tonight. Were these illustrations acts of clarity? Quiet rebellion? Visual memory aids? Historians disagree. Some claim they were a necessary tool for confession. Others think they were an outlet, a chance for scribes to express skepticism, irony, even humor. Because here's the thing, the church tried to regulate behavior, but knowledge? That's harder to fence in. Once a diagram exists, once it's copied 10 times by sleepy monks with too much ink and not enough supervision, it spreads. Quietly. Widely. And not just to men. Some midwives and women religious also read these texts. One preserved manuscript from a women's convent includes a heavily annotated copy of a confessor's manual, with added notes in the margins that include things like, "This is never comfortable." Or, "Saint and forgive us, the knees are wrong." Practical advice? Probably. Sarcastic commentary? Almost certainly. Let's not forget the doctors. Medical texts in 1250 often overlapped with theology, particularly when discussing the body. The Trotula, a set of medieval medical texts focused on women's health, included anatomical diagrams, fertility advice, and even references to bedroom difficulties between spouses. Some of the descriptions are frank, if awkward. And many of the copied editions, again, contain small, precise sketches in the corners. Fringe example, a copy of the Trotula housed in Bologna contains a delicate ink drawing of a man and woman lying side by side, fully clothed, with arrows pointing to various joints, as if intimacy were a battle map. A caption below reads, "Here the humors mingle, if God allows." Poetry? Or health advice? Who's to say? And what of censorship? Oh, it happened. Lists of prohibited books began circulating by the end of the 13th century. Certain texts were condemned. Others corrected. Some monasteries ordered specific folios to be cut out and burned, though not always before the monks took a curious peek. But even when pages vanished, stories survived. They were whispered, rephrased, re-illustrated. The content never truly disappeared. It just moved. One scribe, centuries ahead of his time, drew a man handing a scroll to another man behind a bush, with a Latin caption, "All things forbidden become more precious." You lie in your bed now, considering this strange contradiction. A church that condemned nudity, yet preserved detailed manuals about the movements of the flesh. A world that told you not to think of certain things, while making very sure to describe them. And you wonder, did those monks giggle when they drew that tiny devil? Did they feel guilty? Or smug? Or maybe just human? Because behind every scroll and sketch, there was a hand. A hand holding a quill. And a mind full of questions, curiosity, maybe even compassion. These weren't cartoon villains enforcing a code. They were people trying to understand the mysteries of the body, the burdens of desire, the boundaries of faith. And sometimes, understanding meant drawing diagrams. So tonight, as you slip deeper into sleep, think of those quiet ink marks made by candlelight. Some were warnings. Some were notes. Some were little jokes scratched into the margins of eternity. And all of them, in their own awkward way, were part of the conversation we're still having about the body, the soul, and the stories we tell ourselves to make peace between the two. You're deep in the night now, tucked inside its soft hush like a feather in a folded cloak. The embers of thought glow quietly, steady and warm. But tonight, we open the door to something a little less warm, and much more obligatory. You're stepping into a world where bedtime isn't about affection or passion or even duty. It's about debt. This is the part of the story called the marital debt you couldn't refuse. Mainstream fact: in medieval Christian teaching, particularly by the 13th century, the concept of the marital debt had become a formal part of church doctrine. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal theological obligation, one that said if your spouse asked for intimacy, and you refused without just cause, you sinned. You didn't have to be in the mood. You didn't have to like each other. You just had to say yes. The principle came from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he wrote, "The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband." The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. A surprisingly egalitarian statement, at least on paper. But in practice, this played out unevenly. The church taught that both spouses owed each other conjugal rights, but the power dynamics, the expectations, and the social enforcement tilted heavily toward men. Fringe tidbit: a marital court record from 1256 in Ghent includes testimony from a woman who claimed her husband demanded his debt 5 times a week and grew angry when she declined on feast days. The court reminded him that fast days superseded marital debt, but still instructed her to maintain cheerful willingness on all others. You take a deep breath. That phrase, cheerful willingness, appears more than once in the historical record. Not enthusiastic consent. Not mutual desire. Just dutiful availability. The church was uncomfortable with female sexual desire, but it was very comfortable expecting compliance. And the man's obligations? They were real, too. If a wife requested her right, he couldn't refuse without a spiritual excuse: illness, fasting, religious observance. If he withheld intimacy unjustly, he was in the wrong. The church was clear on this. Even monks-turned-theologians agreed, marriage meant access, even when affection ran dry. This leads to one of the more surreal moments in medieval moral logic: a person could be sinning by saying no to sex. Not because they were cruel, or neglectful, or abusive, but because they denied their partner their sacramental right. And here's your scholarly debate: did this create a culture of mutual respect, or coercion? Some historians argue that the marital debt was a rare moment of sexual parity in medieval law. Women had a legal right to initiate. Their husbands were expected to answer. Others say it was an illusion of equality, because in practice, women had far less power to enforce it, and far more pressure to submit. You lie in the dark, imagining the small moments this doctrine produced. A wife pulling her husband's sleeve. A husband turning to his wife with careful language. "You owe me the debt," he might say. Or she might whisper, "I am not unready." That was a common phrase in the records, "not unready." A soft yes that carried centuries of spiritual responsibility. Let's visit a confession. A woman in Bruges confesses that she denied her husband's request 3 times that week. The priest asks why. She says she was tired. The priest nods, considers, and assigns her 3 days of prayer. He reminds her, fatigue is understandable, but not an excuse forever. In another parish, a man confesses that his wife won't speak to him, let alone lie with him. The priest frowns. There's no clear penalty in the books for this situation. So he improvises: bring her to Mass, speak kindly. Be patient. and pray she remembers her vow. It's easy to read all this as cold or clinical. But within it, you still find small acts of care. There are records of husbands refusing the debt because their wives seemed unwell. Of wives defending their refusals not with defiance, but with dignity. I was bleeding. I was praying. I was grieving. Sometimes, that was enough. Fringe example, a scribe in northern England notes a peculiar court case where both husband and wife claimed the other owed them the debt, on the same night. The court, rather diplomatically, instructed them to lie together, then rise and confess at sunrise. You imagine the awkwardness. And yet, the debt remained a central part of marital theology. A sort of spiritual bookkeeping, sin on one side, forgiveness on the other. The body became a ledger. And the soul, ever watching. Let's not forget the role of the church itself in enforcing these debts. Priests often served as informal marriage counselors, especially in smaller parishes. A couple might come to confession not just for sins, but for silence, emotional distance, arguments, refusals. And the priest's job? To remind them of their vows. To patch over discontent with doctrine. One priest in Rouen wrote, "When the wife grows cold, remind her of the vow. When the husband grows harsh, remind him of Christ." That sounds nice. But you wonder how often it worked. There's a strange comfort in the idea that people were trying. Not always succeeding, but trying. Trying to love. Trying to obey. Trying to find meaning in a system that said yes even when their heart said not tonight. You sigh softly. And somewhere in your mind, a flicker of recognition stirs how even today, people negotiate closeness and distance, desire and exhaustion, duty and longing. Medieval people weren't so different. They argued. They reconciled. They reached for each other. Sometimes out of love. Sometimes out of obligation. Sometimes just because it was Sunday, and the goats had finally stopped bleating, and the night felt long. And maybe that was enough. So tonight, as you lie beside your own thoughts, know this, even in a world of debts and doctrines, affection still bloomed. Even when consent was complicated, people still sought connection. Even when the rules weighed heavy, a soft voice in the dark could still say, "Yes, I'm not unready." The hush tonight feels deeper, like it's not just silence, but memory. A soft-lit recollection of footsteps on old wood floors, of sacred corners and whispered beliefs. And tonight's story? It's not about sin, exactly. Or even rules. It's about faith. Superstition. Magic. Comfort. Tonight, you lie down with holy beds, relics, and romantic superstitions. Mainstream fact, in 1250, many couples didn't just keep icons above their hearth or candles near their saints. They brought holiness to bed, sometimes literally. From relics sewn into pillows to amulets hidden in straw mattresses, the line between devotion and domestic life was deliciously blurry. And sometimes? People hoped the saints would do more than protect them. They hoped they'd help them conceive. Let's start with the bed itself. It wasn't just furniture. For many, the bed was a sacred space. And not in a metaphorical way. Couples kept rosaries under pillows, tucked holy medals into mattress seams, and blessed the sheets, especially on wedding nights or feast days of fertility saints. Fringe tidbit, in parts of rural France, it was common to sprinkle holy water on the bed before lying down. Not just for protection, but to chase away bad dreams and impure thoughts. One priest in Rouen reportedly advised newlyweds to cross their mattress 3 times, once for purity, once for patience, and once for fruitful labor. You're smiling now. Not because it's silly, but because it's so very human. People believed the saints listened. That they watched. That they might even nudge things along, gently, of course, if you asked politely. Certain saints became unofficial patrons of the bedroom. Saint Anne, Mary's mother, was frequently invoked for fertility. Saint Margaret, too, especially in childbirth. And Saint Joseph? Quiet, humble, often called upon for a peaceful home and a well-behaved husband. Let's talk relics. Small bones, bits of cloth, splinters of the true cross, these sacred items were sometimes placed near beds or wrapped in cloth and tied to headboards. Why? Protection. Encouragement. Insurance. One record tells of a couple who traveled 3 villages away just to sleep with a cloth that had touched St. Valentine's reliquary. They were told it would warm the womb and soften the seed. No word on whether it worked, but they did donate a piglet to the parish the next year, so hopes were high. Here's your scholarly debate: were these practices truly endorsed by the church, or simply tolerated folk religion? Some historians believe local priests quietly encouraged them, if only to keep their flock from turning to less sanctioned sources. Others argue these superstitions thrived despite the church's attempts to rein them in. And that brings us to the odd world of bed charms. These weren't magic spells in the way we think of them, but prayers, phrases, sometimes nonsense rhymes written on bits of parchment and tucked beneath pillows or into mattress cords. One surviving charm, written in Middle English, reads, "As Joseph slept and dreams were true, so may our bed be clean and new. Saint Mary guard, Saint John be near. Let no bad thing come touching here." It rhymes. It comforts. It probably helped more than a sermon. And then there were the miracle feathers. Yes, miracle feathers. Some couples believed that keeping a single white feather from a dove, or, more rarely, from a church's altar cloth, would protect the marriage bed from spiritual attacks. One bishop tried to ban the practice, calling it birdly nonsense. The very next week, his clerks reported that his own sister kept 3 feathers under her mattress. One for peace, one for purity, and one, she claimed, for interesting dreams. Fringe example: in a Flemish town near Bruges, a newlywed couple was gifted a small pillow filled with lavender, rose petals, and a single thread from a nun's habit. It was meant to bring calm, devotion, and modest affection. Whether it succeeded or not, the pillow was passed down 2 more generations. But not all bedroom beliefs were about protection. Some were aspirational. One superstition held that saying a specific prayer before bed, 12 nights in a row, would grant a woman a dream revealing the face of her future child. Another taught that drinking a wine infused with rosemary and sage, on a full moon, would loosen the limbs and calm the nerves for a better marital experience. These were never approved. But they weren't always condemned either. Priests looked the other way. Some muttered disapproval. A few probably used the wine themselves. And this is where the story softens. Because underneath all the rules and worries, people were still people. They wanted comfort, connection, reassurance that what they were doing mattered, not just physically, but spiritually. That the warmth they felt under a shared blanket could be blessed. That love, even awkward, sleepy, and sometimes rule-bending love, could be holy. One couple, in a preserved letter, wrote to their local priest, "We place the cross between our pillows, not to divide us, but to remind us. If God sees us, let him see we try to love as he commands." It's not a confession. It's not a plea. It's a quiet poem wrapped in parchment. You nestle further under your own covers now. It's comforting to know that even in a world full of fasts and feast days, of demon warnings and posture diagrams, people still lit candles and whispered prayers. They still tied knots in the corners of bedsheets for luck. They still tucked rosemary under the frame and hoped. Because maybe, just maybe, a little sacredness lived in the small things, the scent of linen dried in sunlight, the shape of 2 bodies at peace, the hush of the world outside, and a relic in the pillowcase, just in case. You've come so far now. The night wraps you like a second skin, and the road behind you is paved with quiet confessions, woolen sheets, and flickering candlelight. But tonight, a breeze stirs the parchment. A new voice enters the story. One that doesn't whisper obedience. One that starts to ask, why? Tonight, you walk beside the first questioners, the reformers, rebels, and bedroom dissenters. Mainstream fact: by the mid-13th century, church authority was immense. Its teachings on sex, marriage, and morality shaped almost every corner of life. But even then, not everyone followed the script. Some pushed back. Quietly. Carefully. Occasionally with ink and parchment. Occasionally with fire. These weren't revolutionaries in the modern sense. No one was throwing off their robes and declaring open love festivals, not yet, anyway. But they were thinkers, preachers, wives, husbands, people who looked at the blanket of doctrine and said, maybe this doesn't quite fit. Let's begin with a name, Arnold of Brescia. Though active in the 12th century, his ideas lingered into 1250 like smoke after a fire. He preached against clerical wealth, celibacy, and the church's tight grip on marriage. He wasn't concerned with the missionary position, but he was concerned that the church acted like it owned people's bodies. His teachings were eventually condemned, and he was hanged and burned. But his ideas seeped in. Reform wasn't fast. But it had begun. Fringe Tidbit, a lesser-known lay preacher in Aquitaine, name lost to time, was fined for telling villagers that the Spirit moves as it will, and God does not measure love by posture. He wasn't arrested, just warned. But the record shows he gathered a small group who prayed together and shared bread in their homes, rather than going to confession. Then there were the women. Some began to speak up in quiet, brave ways. Letters survive from wives to priests questioning why their desire was always painted as dangerous, while their husbands was excused. One woman, Isabeau of Lyon, wrote, "I am told to close my mouth and open my body. Must both be silent." Her priest never responded, but the letter was copied 3 times into local archives. Somebody was listening. And what about the beguinages? Communities of pious laywomen, technically not nuns, who lived together, prayed, worked, and sometimes cared for the sick. They weren't married. They weren't celibate. They lived in a kind of spiritual grey area that made bishops very nervous. Some beguines wrote poems and mystical reflections that framed love and union as divine gifts, not duties. One beguine, Mechthild of Magdeburg, described spiritual ecstasy using deeply sensual imagery. She wrote, "God presses me to his breast and whispers a sweetness into my soul which makes all earthly touches pale." Her critics accused her of inappropriate metaphor. But she wasn't talking about sin. She was talking about divine love. She just refused to strip the language of its warmth. Your scholarly debate tonight, were these dissenters part of a larger movement? Or were they isolated voices, swept aside by centuries of doctrine? Historians disagree. Some trace threads from these early rebels to the later Protestant Reformation. Others see them as flickers, brief, beautiful, but ultimately extinguished by the Church's broader control. And yet, the flickers kept coming. In the back rooms of universities, younger clerics debated Aquina's rigid teachings. In taverns and marketplaces, women exchanged stories that didn't match what they'd heard from pulpits. "My husband was kind when he smiled," one woman says. "That never made me feel sinful." Or the potter's apprentice who claimed his mother said, "Do right, but don't let the priest into your sheets." Fringe example, a scribe in Saxony was reprimanded for adding unauthorized notes to the margins of his confessional manual. The notes included phrases like, "If they love each other, do not scold them," and "A woman's body is not only for bearing." He was reassigned to a lesser post, but his annotated copy survived. Even within monasteries, some began to question the system. A Cistercian monk wrote in his private journal, "I teach of cold beds and quick acts, but my heart warms when I hear of kindness." Perhaps love itself is a penance we choose. That's not doctrine. That's someone peeking out from behind it. And here's the truth, not all rebellion looks like fire. Sometimes, it looks like a couple holding hands after lights out. A wife saying no and meaning it. A husband waiting, not with entitlement, but tenderness. A monk writing a prayer that says, "God, forgive me for the things I must teach, and help me love the people I must correct." You breathe in deeply now, and you realize, the pressure was real, but so was the resistance. The church shaped much. But it never fully tamed the heart. Even when sin was measured in body positions and feast day missteps, people still sought goodness. Not rule following goodness. real goodness. The kind that listens. That forgives. That adapts. That's why these dissenters matter, not because they overturned the system, but because they cracked the door open. Let in some air. Some light. And so, as you lie still, thinking of Isabeau's letter and the monk's quiet prayer, remember this: the rules were many. The guilt, heavy. But the whisper of something better, something gentler, was always there, just beneath the noise. Even in 1250, someone was already imagining a world where love wasn't measured by silence, but by kindness. Only the faintest breath of night remains. Even the shadows have gone still. And now, as your journey nears its end, we return to where it all began, not in the village beds or the monastic scrolls, but in the realm of belief. Because tonight, you lie quietly and reflect not on who did what with whom, but on why it mattered so much. This is the still, deep pool of the soul, from scroll to soul, the spiritual stakes of bedtime. Mainstream fact: in 1250, marital intimacy wasn't just a physical act. It was viewed as a moment with spiritual weight, an act that touched not only the body but the eternal soul. And because of this, it was deeply entangled with theology. To the medieval church, the bedroom was not a private retreat, it was a spiritual battleground. Each touch, each breath, each thought before, during, and after intimacy could tip the balance between salvation and sin. And it wasn't about performance, it was about intention. Did you lie together for love? For children? For comfort? Or for pleasure? Did your mind wander? Did you speak too sweetly? Did you forget to pray? Fringe tidbit: a particularly anxious guide for confessors from Bohemia includes a checklist of questions for penitent spouses. Some are expected: did you lie together on a feast day? But others? More intrusive. Did your mind turn toward others? Did you imagine anything forbidden? Did you wish for the act to last longer than necessary? You pull the covers up to your chin. Even your thoughts could be sinful. Even enjoyment could invite damnation if not properly aimed toward procreation. One theologian wrote, "Joy in union is only clean if it does not surpass the joy of obedience." You stare at the ceiling and wonder what kind of joy that leaves. This wasn't just guilt for guilt's sake. It was tied to a vision of the cosmos, a belief that every part of life, even the most personal, had to reflect the divine order. Sex wasn't evil. It was dangerous. Sacred. Like fire in a cathedral. Beautiful when tended, destructive when left to burn. And so the church built walls around it. Doctrine. Penance. Protocol. All to protect the soul. But here's your scholarly debate: was this sincere concern for salvation, or anxiety dressed in theology? Did the church truly believe these rules saved people from sin? Or did they fear the messiness of the human body and build doctrine to contain it? Some historians argue this was the best theology could do in a world without psychology. Others see it as spiritual micromanagement, an attempt to control not just action, but affection. Yet not everyone saw desire as disorder. Some mystics believed intimacy mirrored divine love. The union of body and soul. Of Christ and the Church. Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote of her longing for God as a kind of spiritual lovemaking. Bernard of Clairvaux preached the Song of Songs as a sacred romance. But those voices were few. The dominant message was caution. A monk in Saxony wrote, "Better to abstain and be wrong, than to touch and be lost." And so couples lay side by side, shivering from more than cold, wondering if warmth itself could offend. Still, they carried on. They whispered prayers. They held hands in the dark. They confessed. They fasted. And still, they touched, because the soul might tremble, but the heart reached out. Fringe example: in a confession record from 1252, a man admits that he and his wife prayed during intimacy, not just before or after, but during. The priest asked, "What did you pray for?" The man replied, "That it be remembered not as sin, but as love." You breathe that in. Because maybe that's the secret the church feared the most, not that love might become lust, but that love might defy the rules and still feel holy. Maybe the spiritual stakes weren't about sin at all. Maybe they were about letting people believe that something so physical, so human, could still carry light. And yet, the rules remained. Because bodies are messy. Desire is complicated. And the church, like all institutions, preferred clarity. Even if it came at the cost of compassion. But the people? The people found ways to hold both. A wife who said, "Let us pray," and then smiled as she unpinned her hair. A husband who kissed his wife's temple after penance, not in passion, but in peace. A priest who heard a confession and chose mercy over judgment, whispering, "Be kind to one another, for God sees you're trying." So tonight, as the last candle flickers behind your eyes, remember this: 1250 was not only a time of control and guilt, it was a time of hearts trying to be good, trying to follow the scroll while still listening to the soul. People failed. They stumbled. They felt too much. They repented. But they never stopped reaching. For each other. For understanding. For grace. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't the checklist. It was the trying. Your breathing is slow now. Muscles loose. Eyes almost closed. The road has been long, 20 chapters of candlelit caution, sheeple bedding, whispered prayers, and theological gymnastics. But before you drift entirely away, there's one last place to visit. No rules. No penance. Just the quiet room at the edge of the world where all of it, law, love, lust, linen, melts away. Tonight, we visit the final bed, how people hope to die. Mainstream fact: in medieval Christian belief, the deathbed was the most spiritually significant bed of all. Everything else, marriage beds, sickbeds, guest beds, was temporary. But your deathbed? That was the stage where your entire soul's future might be decided in the final breath. And so, people prepared for it. Carefully. Desperately. Often with the same mix of superstition, devotion, and awkward logistics we've seen all along. Because dying well was as much about what you did in life as what you didn't. Let's begin in the early hours, with someone nearing the end. You're in a small cottage, the shutters drawn, the straw roof still holding back the rain. A husband lies beneath 2 wool blankets. His wife kneels beside him, whispering a psalm. The parish priest has come, riding through fog with his sacrament kit strapped to the saddle. Fringe tidbit. One record from 1249 shows a rural priest charging extra grain for a night summons deathbed visit. In his defense, the road was muddy, and he did bring candles. But back to the room. The man confesses. He receives last rites. He is anointed, oil touched to his lips, eyes, hands, feet. The body, once scrutinized for its behavior in the marriage bed, is now washed in mercy. Let all be forgiven, the priest intones. Let all be made clean. This moment mattered more than any other. A peaceful death was the great goal, not just a medical comfort, but a spiritual triumph. Dying in your own bed, with loved ones near, with a priest present, was considered the best possible exit. Here's your scholarly debate: did this belief in a good death motivate people to live more morally, or just more fearfully? Some scholars say it inspired discipline, guiding people to prepare their souls every day. Others argue it led to anxiety, a life lived under the shadow of an uncertain final hour. Either way, people made plans. Some married couples agreed to mutual prayers every night, just in case one of them didn't wake up. One woman in Avignon wrote in her will that she wished to be buried in the same linen she'd slept in with her husband on their wedding night, washed, of course. She called it her garment of both joy and judgment. And yes, sometimes the marriage bed and the deathbed were the same. A man could die beside the same woman he'd shared duties, debts, and dry winter nights with for 30 years. And in that final closeness, the tangled rules no longer mattered. It didn't matter if they'd once been scolded for touching on feast days. It didn't matter if they'd lit candles out of order or whispered too much or not enough. At the end, there was silence. There was holding. There was the slow exhale. Fringe example: a priest in Poitiers wrote in his journal about a wife who insisted on climbing into bed with her dying husband. She held his hand, whispered the Lord's Prayer, and stayed until his chest stilled. The priest had objected, but afterward, he wrote, I believe her presence shortened his purgatory. You shift softly now, and it's hard not to feel the echo. Because all the church's teachings, the bed positions, the feast days, the goose metaphors, they were meant to help people die well. The idea was that purity led to peace. That following the rules would keep you from trembling in your last breath. But not everyone followed the rules. Some couples loved awkwardly, generously, defiantly. They broke the calendar. They touched with affection. And still, they died holding hands, with candles lit and saints invoked. Maybe that was the secret the church never quite admitted. Love, even clumsy love, wasn't the enemy. It was the rehearsal for dying well. You might not know the right prayers. You might forget the feast days. But if you'd loved, if you'd cared, if you'd tried to be kind in the dark, all that counted too. One final fringe visual, a manuscript from the 13th century shows a bed, a priest, a family kneeling. Above the bed, two angels carry a soul skyward. But in the margin, barely visible, is a scribbled note, he loved her more than he feared. That's not doctrine. But it might be salvation. And so, dear traveler, you've reached the edge of the story. You've walked the straw-covered floors of 1250, peeked under sheets stiff with starch, heard the weary sighs of saints and sinners alike. You've laughed, you've blinked in disbelief, and maybe, just maybe, you've seen that even in a world ruled by holy scrolls, the soul often wandered toward kindness. And now? Now it's time to sleep. Let your limbs settle. Loosen your jaw. Let your tongue rest on the roof of your mouth, gently. You've journeyed far tonight, across centuries, through shadows and candlelight, beside beds both humble and haunted. You've seen fear cloaked as virtue. You've heard tenderness wrapped in ritual. And you've felt, quietly, the ache of people just trying to get it right. So as the last threads of this tale unravel, let your breath soften. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. Feel the weight of the blanket, not just on your body, but anchoring you to this moment, to this stillness. The story is finished. There's nothing more to learn tonight. No more confessions to whisper. No diagrams to recall. No saints watching. Only the hush. You are safe. You are not in 1250. No one is checking the calendar. No one is diagramming your sleep posture. It's just you, and this quiet, and the kindness you carry. Let the last flicker of candlelight fade from your mind. Let the voices, gentle, nervous, laughing, drift away like smoke. Let the story close behind you, its cover smooth and cool, waiting for another night. And if dreams come? Let them be soft ones. Let them smell of lavender and old paper and worn linen. Let them carry you not to courts or cloisters, but to the warmth of someone saying, sleep well. You did fine. Because you did. Sweet dreams.